asking depth. So her big question was, should the root ball level or be level? I'm sorry, I'll say that one more time. Should the root ball be level or below the soil line for transplants? So do you push soil on top of the root ball or do you leave it level? So the answer is it kind of depends. And let's go through a couple of categories of plants to understand when you might want it to be level and when you might want it to be below. So this here is in the cabbage family, and we'll talk about that in just one moment. So for most of the plants, they will benefit from the cotyledon being underground, and we talked about why that is in the plant module. And so here you see two plants, and in one case, the cotyledon is below the soil line and one is above. Now, I wanted to add another image here, and I don't see it in my slide, and I apologize. There's a really beautiful image, well, it's a sad image, in the John Jevons How to Grow More Vegetables book, where they show what happens to the plant on the right as it grows. So as it grows, the stem is very soft and fragile below that cotyledon. So what happens if you plant the cotyledon above ground is that the stem starts to look like an S shape. It actually turns down toward the ground where the cotyledon, it's too soft, and so that part starts to bend down towards the earth, and then the rest of the stem is nice and hardy, and so that part of the stem starts to bend back upward. And now you have this S curve to your plant. And remember, this is your circulatory system of your plant. If it's got any kinks like that, think about how hard it's working to get nutrients and water to the plant. It's just not as healthy. So you want to make sure those cotyledons are below the soil line. And oftentimes what I do is when usually before I transplant, the cotyledon have fallen off the transplant for a lot of different varieties, especially if it's in cabbage family, because those crops generally, once they get 5 or 6 leaves on them, the cotyledon just become yellow and kind of fall off on their own, and they're also they're much more flimsy than the true leaves of the plant. So oftentimes I'm planting and the cotyledon isn't even on my transplant. If the cotyledon is still on my transplant, I will oftentimes, instead of burying them underground, because I don't want that leaf matter to decay underground and actually potentially introduce some kind of bacteria to my plant. What I would rather do is very carefully either take a pair of scissors, or if you have sharp fingernails, pinch very, very carefully those cotyledon off the stem without harming the stem, because again, you could introduce some kind of pest or disease wherever there is a nick on the plant. And so you want to just very carefully cut those off. And then I bury up to the first true leaves. I plant all the way up to the first true leaves, and that keeps my stems nice and healthy. So that's the first thing. That's, for most plants, that's what they benefit from. Now, there's a couple of exceptions to this rule where you can actually plant deeper, which is kind of cool. So one of the exceptions is in the tomato family, tomato, eggplant, tomatillos. These are all things that benefit from being planted a little deeper. And the reason why is that the root system, the stem of the plant, and the lower area, it will start to put out even more roots. And so that means the more root system you have, the stronger that plant's going to be more quickly, and so it's going to give you a healthier plant. So oftentimes what people will do with tomato, eggplant, tomatillo, and pepper is they will kind of go diagonally into the ground and drop the plant in and bury the plant. First, what they'll do is they'll take off a couple of the lower leaves, and they will actually take off real lower leaves, so not just the cotyledon, but also a couple of the lower branches. And you want to make sure you have at least 3 upper branches to any of these crops, and then you put the root ball in sideways and kind of bend it upward, and it'll bend on its own when you go to put the soil around it. And then what will happen over time is that photosynthesis will take over, and it'll start to come up vertically from wherever it's emerging from the soil, because it's trying to reach towards the sun essentially. And the other thing this does for people who are growing in really windy areas, rooftops especially, you can really make sure that the plant has a really hardy footing in the ground. So that's another reason why people do this deep planting for some of these crops that get really tall, especially tomatoes. I mean, tomatoes can get up to 10 feet tall, and you really want them to have that solid footing in the ground. So that's a certain group of plants that like the deep planting. And I've found with my cabbage family crops that I plant them deep as well. You can see here, this is a cabbage family crop, and that lower leaf is a true leaf, and it's pretty much underground. So I often will get a really hardy transplant that has at least 5 leaves. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 7 leaves. I can't tell what else is in there. And I might pull off the bottom 2 leaves and then bury it just a little bit deeper. And the reason I do that is because if you look up here at this slide one more time, you notice with my kale and my collard that I'm planting them close together. Sometimes they end up with a little skinnier stem than normal, and so I want to give them the best footing that I can, and so I plant those a little bit deep. And then, all right, so we're on that one. And then let's talk about root crops for a minute. So root crops are a little bit different because what's happening, well, first you're direct seeding, so you're not necessarily transplanting a root crop, right? And so what will happen is the cotyledon will grow above ground, and you don't worry, you don't need to then press the crop back into the ground and bury that cotyledon. Just let it root where it is, and what will happen is that the root crop will actually show just a little bit above ground, and that's totally normal. And it also helps you see how big the crop is getting and when it's going to be ready for harvest. So here you can see radishes sticking out of the ground just a little bit, and that's what they should look like. And also with root crops, when you are transplanting, we talked about transplanting beets and transplanting leeks. When you transplant those beets, oftentimes you just have like the cotyledon and maybe 1 or 2 leaves, and you don't want to bury those cotyledon because the plant is so small, you want it to be able to photosynthesize. So with your root crops, I would say leave the cotyledon above ground. Now there's one exception, of course, because there's always an exception in Mother Nature, because there's always biodiversity, right? And and I haven't shown it here, planting garlic is definitely different. It's a monocot versus a dicot, and that one you will never ever see actually the cotyledon, or you won't recognize it as cotyledon. It'll look like just a typical garlic stem, and that's totally normal. So the one exception with root vegetables is leeks. And with leeks, when you go to the store, I'm curious how you buy your leeks. For me, I look for the leeks with the most amount of white, or at the farmer's market, because that is the part of the crop that is the tenderest and it is the sweetest. And so if your goal is to grow a really good leek, what you actually want to do is continue to bury your leek more and more over time to increase the amount of white space, because the white is essentially the root system underground, and it's the part that's not getting photosynthesis energy, and so therefore it's remaining white. So this is the exception. When I grow my leeks, what I do is I generally transplant them in, so very carefully transplant them in, and then as they grow, I'll just add more soil I'll basically mound the soil, and my bed, I'll just take it from the bed next to it, so it'll actually change the shape of the bed, and I'll start mounding up. And I just want to make sure that there's, about 6 inches above ground at all times. And so as it gets taller, I just keep burying it more and more. All right, so that's a little bit about depth and different transplants.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And for more simple and practical gardening tips, subscribe to grow your own vegetables. For more tips and updates, visit gyov.org and join our growing community.